It started with three of us, myself, Ted Santarelli, John Amlaw from Somerville, I was from Boston at the time, and Gerald Cunningham from Haverhill, Mass., all coming together on a railfan trip in Lewiston, Maine on the 19th of April in 1939. And we had all passed our favorite little small-town trolley system, the Biddeford and Saco, on the way up, which ran open cars much later than most other systems in the summertime. It was quite a pet of ours, and as we were discussing things on the trip, Gerald Cunningham said, "Fellows, they've ordered the buses," meaning the Biddeford and Saco was going to give up the trolleys. At this point, the three of us more or less simultaneously said, "Well, we've got to save one of the cars." We didn't have any idea how we were going to do it. Each one of us had had an unsuccessful interest in something like that in the past, and we knew that an individual of our means couldn't do anything like this, but possibly if a few of us got together, we could do something. We had all tried something at one time or another to try to fix up a car someplace on a railway company's property, and this had been turned down because of insurance problems and union problems and whatever. And we knew that the only way that we were ever going to do anything was to band rail fans together and start some sort of a project. Well, the whole business started then with Jerry Cunningham going to the president of the Biddeford and Saco Railroad soon after the trip and suggesting that we'd like to buy a car. And Mr. Stride, the president, thought it over, of course lectured Jerry how you couldn't do anything like this and so forth, and said, "Well, supposing I sell you a car, I've made a promise to all my friends in the Rotary Club in Biddeford that we would have no more car bodies around the Biddeford, Saco, and Old Orchard area." Well, Jerry assured him that, of course, we wouldn't do that. We would take the car someplace else. So he quoted a price of around $300. This, in Depression times, is quite a steep amount of money for those of us, but we continued to negotiate and think about it and talk to our friends. And we came back one day to see Mr. Stride at his home in Biddeford and wound up cutting the grass for him and discussing the whole situation. And the result of the meeting was the price dropped to $150. This we seemed to think we could raise, and we began to go out and talk to our friends about it. And one of our very early members, named Charlie Brown, decided to have a fan trip on the Biddeford and Saco, a farewell trip. This was, of course, the best chance to get people together and see if we could sign up as many members as possible. And we came up with about 15 who said that they'd go along with the idea. Then, at this point, Jerry Cunningham had to take off, and he was going into the Air Force and went down to Texas, leaving Mr. Amlaw and myself pretty much to try to make the arrangements on this. The first great problem was, where do you take a trolley car if you take it out of Biddeford, Saco, and Old Orchard areas? Well, being from Boston, Somerville in John Amlaw's case, why, the next best bet would be to go to the next town below. So we came down to Kennebunkport, and we thought what a wonderful place this car barn down at Townhouse would be. There was still the pit section and the track and the overhead crane, and this would be just great. And of course the person that owned the barn would be very enthusiastic about this idea. But we talked to him, and he said, "You'd be very foolish to leave the car here. Vandals would tear it apart and so forth. What you want to do is find a place on a farm where you can get the people there to be interested in just keeping an eye on it for you when you're not here except on weekends." So he said, "I have a friend up the road named Everett Clow, and he and his family have a farm." So we came up to the Clow farm, and were met by old Mr. Clow, Fred Clow, who had been a motorman on the Atlantic Shoreline trolleys that had run right by there in the old days. And he liked the idea and was about to suggest something. His wife leaned out the window and said, "There are going to be no electric cars around here." Well, she turned out to be one of our greatest friends afterwards. Nonetheless, they said there is a small strip of land that was cut off in the old days by the abandoned Atlantic Shoreline, and it belongs to Mr. Hill down the road, George Hill. Why don't you go talk to him about it? Well, my friend Mr. Amlaw was the salesman, but somehow or other he was a little bit short on speaking that day and sort of left me to do the talking. We went over to see Mr. Hill, who was quite hard of hearing, had a hearing aid, and had to shout 2 or 3 times that we were going to save an electric car. And Mr. Hill thought this was very funny and saw no reason at all why we shouldn't, and he'd be willing to rent us a piece of land. And very nice about it, and even proposed that someday if we chose to buy the land, he'd charge us several $100s for it, and would stick to his word. So the next problem, having solved that for the moment, is how do you get the car here? We had no automotive equipment, no way of going at a thing like this at all. But we went up to a garage in Biddeford, and this was a little bit more Mr. Amlaw's ball game, you might say, because he knew more about trucks and automotive equipment. And we found the person that owned this garage quite willing to help us out, but he said he had given his sold his truck, his wrecker, a few years ago to someone over in Alfred, which was on the way to Sanford. And he said, why don't you go over and see him? And we did, and he said he thought the idea was rather amusing too, and laughed and said, why? He said, I'd be glad to loan you fellows anything. I'll loan you my wife, he said. And he laughed and said, all right, when you're ready, he said, we'll get the truck. Well, time was running out. More ideally, we would have tried to move the car out someplace away from the two Boston and Maine bridges that locked the track in there in that particular area. But there's nothing to be done about it. And then to make matters worse, when the trolleys stopped, they took out a couple of the tracks to get their buses into the shop and back, leaving no room whatsoever to move the cars anywhere. You couldn't simply move them out and move our car, number 31, which we'd selected, out to the front of the building. So there was no chance to do anything but load it in back. So the arrangements were made, and a certain day I was to be there, and we proceeded to get the car ready to move. And the idea was to jack the front end of the car up and haul it with his wrecker, and to put a set of a truck rear end under the back end. We had to mount the car just as low as it would have been in regular service on the track because of the two railroad underpasses, either one of which we'd have to go under. So in those days, we didn't seem to discuss permits with anyone. You just moved something. And I was alone at first and started to jack the car up, and thought, of course, the Biddeford Saco people would drop everything and come running over and do all sorts of things. Well, they very nicely sat on the back bench of one of their other open cars and threw an old track jack at me and a pile of wood and said, well, go to it. Well, I started to jack the car up. I'd never done anything in my life like this before, and I'd gotten it up a couple of feet in the air on one end, and fortunately John Amlaw came along, and the two of us managed to get it way up over our heads and roll the truck out, and then lower it down onto a couple of rails that we had sticking out of the back end. We chained up through motor traps, and then had them resting on this truck rear end. And we did the same on the front end, had to jack it up and roll the truck out. And the next day, I was all alone, and the several people arrived with their wrecker, and they proceeded to hook onto the front end of the car with a chain and pick it up. Well, unfortunately, it was an old automobile wrecker, when they would put the crane at the best angle to protect the car, it would start to bring the front end of their truck up in the air. So they were kind of nonplussed what to do about that, because if they got the right angle for pickup, it would bash the front end of the car in. So I came up with an absurd but a workable solution. They had a rather heavy, smaller truck, and I said, why don't you chain the front of your truck onto that and hold it down? Well, it worked. The only problem was that we couldn't turn any sharp corners with this rig, and the piece of the car barn was in the way. Well, the building wrecker said, you want that out of there? And he sent his men over, tore that piece of the barn down, and out we went. We came down with the car body, dragged it in around the corner, just left it on the ground, and then the two trucks each were picked up by the smaller truck and just swung on a chain and came down, and they were plunked in the bushes. And this was the very unauspicious start of the whole thing, and my neighbors were very unhappy because we'd dug up a section of their road and dragging the car in. Well, I was spending my summers in Peaks Island at that time, and the only way to get here, for me, was to take the steamboat across to Portland, the trolley from the Custom House up to Monument Square, and a bus to Old Orchard, and the Biddeford and Saco bus to the outskirts of Biddeford, and then walk down about 4 miles down the right-of-way, which I did, borrowed a shovel from them, fixed their driveway, returned the tools, and walked back. Well, this made a fair impression on them. They became our staunchest friends afterwards in running our museum. The we didn't have a name, and I was very fond of an interurban line in Ohio called the Lakeshore Electric, so we decided we'd call ourselves the Seashore Electric. We had no real thoughts about where we'd go, but we knew that someday the public would begin to be interested in what we were doing, because the day of the final fan trip, and this became an important factor in our thoughts afterwards, the local people didn't pay much attention to the car, but we stopped one place at a turnout, and several automobiles drove up from out of state, New Jersey, I believe, and the people dashed out and said, "Gee, I haven't ridden an open trolley in years," and they jumped on board, you know, and they were thrilled to see one again. Well, we realized that if the certain period of time went by when this was just something that they were discarding and going for their beautiful new buses, that someday people would come to be nostalgic again about this whole operation. So we now had a place to locate the car. We began to come up on Saturdays and Sundays and put the car together. We had a young friend that had worked for the trolley company who came down and gave us instructions in building track and got us started in reassembling the car. And we bought a second car body that fall without any equipment in it, just for a tool house. And we were going to settle down for just the one car for a while. But the next year, Manchester Street Railway in New Hampshire was going out, and there were rumors that a group from Connecticut were going to buy one of the cars that we liked, had found a piece of abandoned right-of-way somewhere up country there, and they were going to build a line there. Well, we found that thought that was going to be rather damaging to our very small group at that time, that we'd better join forces with them and talk them into bringing the car over here. And it wasn't very long before the whole thing was dumped in our laps to carry out this operation. They would contribute money toward the purchase of the car and so forth, but it was going to be up to the treasurer and myself to carry this thing out. We started making weekly overtures to the Street Railway Company to try to buy number 38, and seemed to be repulsed. Well, sort of come back next week and we'll make a decision then. And this went on for some time, and we were getting very near to the end of the operating time of the street railway. It's going to be set for April of that spring. This would be April 1940. So I mentioned this to my dad, who was in the First National Bank of Boston at the time, and he said, "Well, why not go through the bank and let's see if we can't get you a letter of introduction from the officer of the Public Service New Hampshire account." So we tried that approach, and we went right up to the Public Service building on Elm Street, and Mr. Schiller was occupied at the time. His assistant, Roger Moscrop, talked to us about it, seemed to be very enthusiastic, and said, "Why, certainly, we think it's a great idea." Well, we were very short on funds, and we proposed a price of around $75 for the car on the trucks, and perhaps several $100s more if we bought the motors. And he thought this was a good idea. So we started coming up there on weekends and painting the car up and finding any missing parts and getting the car ready to go. And we stood around the car the last night, afraid that somebody would take souvenirs from it. And at that point, Mr. Moscrop and some of the other public service people walked by and said, he said to them, "This is the entire car, is the property of the Seashore Electric Railway," we called it. And no more was said. We were making our plans to move the car. We approached the Boston and Maine, got a cost of a flat car shipment over to Kennebunk. We got a price from a company then called the Chase Transfer Company in Portland, to riggers, to load the car, offload it from the flat car and bring it here. And we contacted a trucking company, and the head of the company, Eau Claire Company in Manchester, and they were very good about it, and said that, "Well, all right, if you can bring the car over to this siding, we'll come down from our place and rig the car on the flat car for you, and we'll store the trucks for you until you can afford to move them another year." So the next problem came, and the trolley line had now stopped, but the power was kept on in the car barns on both sides of Traction Street, and cut off from the rest of the city and the rest of the lines. They were dismantling bit by bit the trolley wire at various parts of the city. And they had a very wonderful foreman in charge of the work there, who had been in charge of much of the system when it was running, and Mr. McFarland. And we talked to him about how we were going to get the car across the river to the other side. And with his tongue in his cheek, he said, "Well, why don't you call Mr. Schiller downtown and see if he'll put the power on?" Of course, expecting that Mr. Schiller would say absolutely not. So very innocently, I went to the phone and called him up, and he said, "Why, certainly, Mr. Santarelli. Be glad to do that for you. Just have Mr. McFarland pull the switch and put it on again, and he can run the car over for you to the other side of the river." And he said, "I hope nobody's out stealing trolley wire today. They're going to be in for an awful surprise." Well, one other friend of mine from Somerville, Dan Toomey, was with me, and we proceeded to get in the car. And Mr. McFarland made the trip very enjoyable for us by saying that, now remember, this car is not being operated by the New Hampshire Public Service. This is the Seashore Electric Railway. At this point, we both began to shiver and shake a little bit. We didn't enjoy the last trolley ride in Manchester, New Hampshire as much as we should have, nor the last trolley ride over the Merrimack River ever by any trolley car under its own power. But nonetheless, this was the case. This was getting into the end of June or early in July. I've forgotten the date. We got across the river, and we came to the place where the railroad crossed with a 90-degree crossing called a diamond. And then Mr. McFarland said, "Well, now what are you going to do about it?" Well, we looked at each other, and before we began to shrink into the ground, he said, "Very well," he said, "we're supposed to be taking down trolley wire today, but what the heck," we said, "we'll help you out." So they proceeded to throw some re-railing irons they normally use for putting a car back on the track down on the ground, and from their public service truck, and they started to derail the car and jack the trucks gradually around the corner. And everything was fine with one truck still on the track. You had your ground and we had the trolley on the wire. But when the second truck came off, there was a crowbar that was making the connection between the wheel of the trolley and the rail, and set out some pretty terrible flashes. We had had a permit for moving the car supposedly at between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. This was hardly that. This was late Friday afternoon. But because the public service truck was there, why, it looked very much on the up and up, so the police simply directed traffic, and we helped them direct traffic around it. And in a matter of about an hour, the back end, the rear truck of the car plumped down on the railroad track. They put a hook with a pole called a bug on the trolley car with about 500 feet of insulated wire, and the other on the trolley pole of the car, and the other on the trolley wire. And the car very nicely proceeded down to the siding, much to the Boston and Maine surprise. They hadn't seen a trolley car run into its own power on their own track ever before. The deal with the operation was over for the night. The next morning, Eau Claire's people came down. They jacked the car up, and we pushed the flat car under it. They blocked it down. And I had read in the car manufacturer's instruction on shipping cars that you must always lock all the doors from inside the car and then climb out through the motor traps, which I did. And the car arrived several days later in Kennebunk Station, and the Chase Transfer people brought it here. It took some months before we had the money and the means to bring the other trucks over from New Hampshire. Well, that's how we started, really, with a fledgling collection, and then one more car was brought over from Manchester. I think that was a bit of a more amusing operation. We didn't buy the truck for the car, just the car body, and Mr. Amlaw made these arrangements. There seemed somebody in Manchester that was very interested in making $30 or $40 in this move, so we told him to go ahead whenever he was ready. Well, we came up one weekend and the car was here, no questions asked. But one day, our neighbors said that he just drove in with an old coupe and a set of wheels under the car, and he'd brought it all the way over from Manchester by just hauling it as a trailer. And sure enough, there was a part of the thing still blocked under the car. Well, we were puzzled how we were going to get a truck for the car, and the trolleys in Portland were being scrapped. It was a very great shame to us that we hadn't been able in the same year to buy a complete car. Well, they would have given us one. We didn't know how we'd move it down here. And we had been assured that a Portland car would be saved, and it wasn't. But we did go and ask for a truck from a car that they were going to scrap. So we got our neighbor to come up with his automotive truck, and it took us 2 weekends because of various delays and things, but we jacked the car over and rolled it down this embankment, brought the truck down here, and eventually mounted it under the other car. And that's about where we stopped until the end of World War II, when most of us had to go off overseas, and a few weekend or occasional trips with gas rationing would be managed somehow or other to come up here and cut grass and do a little protective work on the roof. Now, from that point on, we began to grow like topsy, because right after the war, a lot of the small town operations and a lot of the older cars on the big systems like Boston began to go suddenly, and it became a terrible race against time to lay track out to bring still more cars over. And the very car that in back of us here was one of the last of the older type that the Eastern Mass Street Railway operated to Stoneham. And they finally agreed to sell us the car, and we had it moved up here. By this time we were able to afford to have a rigger do this, but the cost was very expensive, and as our collection grew, it began to be a matter of stalling for time, having cars stored. Yeah. Well, as our collection began to grow and our means didn't keep pace with it, we began to find ourselves with cars in New Haven to move up here, cars in Boston that were stored at different car houses with a reminder every 2 or 3 months when you're going to get that car out and so forth. And that's when we got into the transportation business ourselves very, very suddenly. And this was carried off as a surprise to me. We had a member who had a tractor, was going to go was hauling shoes from Haverhill down to Boston, was going to get a semi-trailer for it.
Did the Atlantic Shore Line build the line from Kennebunk to Bedford?
Well, all right. The origin of the trolley operations in this area started with a small trolley line between Springvale and Sanford, because the grades were too steep coming into Sanford where the mills were for railroad construction. So they came through Springvale, and the trolley line connected and began to get freight cars, haul freight cars back and forth, and they had a small trailer that they hauled with a single truck car. So it started really with a small company with the name Mousom River Railroad. Then the idea came to build the line over to Kennebunk, and from Kennebunk over to Cape Porpoise. And the new name of the company was the Sanford and Cape Porpoise Railway, with the idea that they would have a wharf built to haul coal. You see, schooners would bring coal in, and they would haul coal from there to Sanford and cut the costs of getting the coal for their mills, or at least they would also, of course, by having an alternate water route, you see, you can get better rates from the railroad too. And they had interchanges both at Kennebunk Station and at West Kennebunk Station on the old Eastern Division, which is long gone now. And they could haul cars from there or bring cars down there if they chose to, plus the interchange they had at Springvale. Then the line began to expand, and in 1908 they built the line from the car house here, not from downtown Kennebunkport. They came a back road to Townhouse with a spur down to the port. Then they built the line through this area up to Biddeford. And about this time, they constructed a brand new line south of Kennebunk, down to Ogunquit, down to York Beach, and connected with the Portsmouth, Kittery, and York, and combined it all under the name Atlantic Shore Line Railway. A few years later, the line ran into default on bond payment, or something, interest payment on bonds, or something of the sort, and they reorganized and called it the Atlantic Shore Railway. And this continued until about 1922, when the long runs became impossible to maintain, and the Portsmouth, Kittery, and York broke away. It was now called the Portsmouth, Dover, and York, and the line was severed from York Beach to Kennebunk, but continued to operate up on the northern end under the new name York Utilities Company. And the name might seem unusual for a railway, but they also had a water dam and power plant part way over to Sanford and used to supply power to the mills. So it really, in all respects, was a utility company in more than one respect. They continued to run trolleys every 3 or 4 hours apart from Biddeford down to Kennebunk and over to Sanford, but in time the line became too difficult to maintain, and finally they retrenched to just Sanford and Springvale, the original car line, and they took down the casino that they'd built in Cape Porpoise. Of course, part of the idea of Cape Porpoise was to carry the coal to the mills, but to carry people back and forth in the summertime to their casino. So when this had all vanished, they tore the casino down and rebuilt it as their car barn in Sanford, and continued to operate that way. About the time that York Utilities was going out of the trolley business, the Cumberland County Power and Light, a subsidiary of the Central Maine Power Company, wanted to get hold of the high tension wires on their poles running from Kennebunkport up to, and frankly all the way down toward Ogunquit to Biddeford. So they came in and bought the right-of-way from the York Utilities, and that was really the situation when we came in here. We owned a little strip of land alongside of the right-of-way down below here, and I had a meeting with the general manager, Mr. Haggis, of the Cumberland County in Portland, and he said he would rather not have us provide an entrance way down at the end of our property on their right-of-way, but he sketched out how we could cross it and go out to the road at the end. It had always been very difficult for us to bring cars in here. So we accomplished this. More years went by, and we were notified by now the Central Maine Power had taken over directly, that they were going to build a new high tension line, which we see crossing here, and it was going to be a higher voltage. They would no longer need the roadbed. They would be glad to deed it over to us, and which they did. And we marked about as far as we wanted to leave the poles up, and this was all carried out, and in short order the new line took over, and we were free to extend along the roadbed as we chose. We ran into a problem in that we had really not set aside enough land for ourselves, enough use of the right-of-way, to a point where the new line recrossed, and their poles were now too close for our operation. So we negotiated back and forth with them, and we used rather homespun language in talking to the power company about doing something on the installment plan, and this didn't really quite strike a note with them. But finally one day I had a conversation with our chairman of the board, who went up to Augusta and contacted them, and he said, we said, why don't we try their language and say that we'd like to amortize this over about a 10-year period. The power company understood this then. This is the way they did business. And they then proceeded to move the poles. We made a down payment, and we made annual payments for 10 years until we paid that debt off. It seemed as though we wanted to go even farther on the right-of-way, having extended the tracks that far. We had no problem in arranging a second one with them to move the balance of the poles, at which point their new power line went off in a different direction, and the right-of-way then remained completely ours to use, and we're heading that way as fast as we can these days. We have acquired more land gradually down here from our neighbors to make this more viable and to provide room for a parking lot and a new visitor center and a turn-back loop for our cars. And one of our neighbors had approached us about how much they wanted for an acre of land, and I think I offered something like $2,000. Some of my friends felt that was too much per acre. So our next-door neighbor said, well, he said, it's not the price per acre we're concerned with or how many acres you have, it's the amount of money that we need for the new barn we're going to build. So he said, supposing we sell you 2 acres for that. So he offered to come right down and cut down these pine trees, and I said, for heaven's sakes, don't, and that's become our visitors' picnic grove ever since. And we sort of expanded by bits and pieces. Then we went through a period of acquiring land gradually up along the right-of-way here, and it was with the oncoming of the Biddeford Airport, it seemed senseless to try to go straight up to Biddeford on the right-of-way. We decided then to acquire land going to the left to go over toward Route 1. We do own land out there. We had a short-term operation for a few years there, but it was really too much for us to carry on work at 2 different properties, and at that point we consolidated our efforts here. But we are working, building a better terminal out there and gradually laying our tracks in that direction. And some trackage has been laid by one of our members out there for a new and better terminal on Route 1, which is a long-term project for us, but we nonetheless have the land, and we do have our right-of-way on the historic register, and we've made some swaps of land with the Biddeford Airport.
Where I drive my car in at that sign, where was the Atlantic Shoreline Railway?
Well, it stayed on that side of the road all the way down until you got to Townhouse. Now, see, the Townhouse is gone. Townhouse is gone, and the car barn's gone. There is a Grange Hall there, and there's a grocery store, and there's a trucking terminal there today. And that triangle in there was the Atlantic Shoreline's very nice brick building and shops. It burned once, and they replaced it with a lot more steel work and replaced the brickwork in it. And it formed an angle across the road that could be reached from their line up their spur from Kennebunkport, or it could be reached from their main line that came over the back way from Kennebunk. But it did not, the main line did not go from Kennebunk to Kennebunkport. It crossed over where the landing is today. They had a trestle there, and they had a little power station, and then it was on the right-hand side of the road that you follow all the way across until you got to Townhouse. At Townhouse, they had a kind of a triangle of track, and they had a little station in the middle. And the line did cross the road then, came over to the east side of the road that becomes Log Cabin Road, and the two only separated at the very beginning of our property. And that's where we started. It was that little wedge, you see, where the road goes like that, and we continued straight. Well, the original track ran right straight in from approximately where the entrance sign is, down through our service road today, and continued on to a point that we call Doherty's Switch. And at that point, our track comes out on it. It proceeds in a tangent to a curve called Meserves, and there's a nice, very long radius curve through there, and then it proceeds on a tangent again to a curve, a much sharper one, at a rock cut called Gregoire's. Then the line is an absolute straight line from there into Granite Street in Biddeford. And we own it, we were given the right-of-way all the way to Biddeford, but gradually the town is built down alongside of it, you see. And the only highway crossing was a place called Proctor Road, and from there on it was completely private right-of-way to within about a quarter of a mile of the outskirts of the city at that time. Although we were given the right-of-way right all the way up there, the city had been gradually building up, coming south along that road. So we now would consider that our new line, as we are building it, would go not much farther, let's say, or no farther than Proctor Road crossing, and then would curve to the left, and then would head west out to Route 1. And we've acquired properties along both sides of that right-of-way. We have deeded over some of the other right-of-way, or in the process of it, to the Biddeford Airport that would come across, you see, the original Atlantic Shoreline right-of-way. And we are heading out toward a future terminal on Route 1 at about the Biddeford Arundel line. When we incorporated our society in 1941, we chose the name New England Electric Railway Society Incorporated. We also have gradually shifted from the use of the name Seashore Electric Railway to Seashore Trolley Museum, which is wholly owned by the Society, as a more descriptive name of our operations. The fact, however, that we chose the name New England in our corporate name does not limit our scope in the least. We are very interested in trying to obtain, and have obtained as much as possible, a standard car from some of the leading systems in our country. We have obtained cars from some of the capital cities in the world as much as possible, from Rome, from London, from Berlin, and we now have an Ottawa car that's going to take much rebuilding in Canada that's going to be coming. And have never really limited our efforts to this part of the country alone. The Seashore Trolley Museum was founded for the purpose of preserving trolley cars from destruction. Unfortunately, only a very few transit companies had any thought whatsoever of preserving anything for historical purposes. A trolley car worn out or replaced by buses or some other mode of transportation was something to be scrapped and forgotten. And the only way that any of us could finally accomplish anything, a lot of us had tried individually to have a car preserved, or to go in on somebody else's property and work on a car, and this just did not work at all. And therefore we decided on the spur of the moment, when one of our most favorite small-town trolley lines was about to be abandoned, that this was the time to move in and to secure a car and move it someplace where we could work on it in our own time, at our own speed. And this is the way we started, with one car, with no great thought that we were going to have more cars, or that we would develop into a museum of this size. But times have changed, and we've grown sort of like Topsy, and have acquired cars from all over the country and from other parts of the world, as much as we've been able to secure and try and preserve here.